Boldwood presents Gold Digger, written by Gillian Godden and read by Fiona Honan-Bowes. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Survival. The sound of gunshots filled the air, men firing aimlessly into the black night lit up only by the half-moon. 2 young women were running blindly across a potato field the size of a football pitch when one stumbled and fell. Julie was covered in mud and bleeding from the scratches of the bramble bushes used as fences around the fields to stop anyone from escaping. She looked down at the girl on the ground, crying and gasping for breath. "Get up, Frankie!" Holding her side, Julie stood upright and threw her head back to fill her lungs with air. Her chest felt crushed and she could only speak in between breaths. Every part of her body ached, but fear and adrenaline were spurring her on. "I can't," Frankie sobbed. "I've hurt me ankle and I can't run any more." Her tearful eyes looked up at Julie pleadingly. "Let's go back. I can't take any more." Sweating and crying and smeared with mud, Frankie had given up. They had miles to go yet. "Are you fucking crazy? This is our only chance. God only knows they will kill us anyway. We can't go back. Don't you understand?" Panting and breathless, Julie looked around the dark farmland. There was nothing to guide their way, only instinct. "Listen to me. They are not going to let us get away with this. These bastards do not want troublemakers like us." Frankie lay face down in the mud, sobbing. "Like you mean?" Turning her head, she looked accusingly at Julie, who stood over her, her eyes wild with fear. "Why did you do it? This was all your idea." Guilt washed over Julie, and she brushed away her own tears while listening to her sister's recriminations. It was true. This was all her own doing. But now she was going to free them from those few months of torture. "Get the fuck up or I'll drag you! Ankle or no ankle, we have to keep going!" Julie's heart was pounding so much she could hear it like drums in her ears. Her chest hurt from lack of air and the pain in her side made her wince. Half bending over, she gulped in more air. Hearing a noise, she swiftly turned her head to look behind them. It was not just the gunfire and the smell of sulphur in the air. They'd let the dogs out, those half-starved, vicious dogs. Now they really were in trouble. Grabbing Frankie's arm, Julie started to pull and drag her sister across the dirty field, both of them breathless. "Frankie, we have to go now." The urgency in Julie's voice brought Frankie back to reality. "Is that those horrible dogs I can hear? Are they coming for us?" More tears fell down her mud-encrusted face. "Yeah. Are you going to get up and run now? Because believe me, when they get you, they'll tear you apart." The very idea of those crazed Alsatians and Rottweilers tearing them limb from limb made her panic. Fear gripped Julie, and as much as she wanted to, she couldn't shout at Frankie. In the dark night, she realised her voice would echo and give their pursuers a clue as to their whereabouts. Frankie managed to stand, but winced at the pain in her ankle where she'd stumbled on a rock. She was bleeding and her clothes were torn. Taking one more look backwards, Julie could hear the barking getting louder and closer. She took her vest top off and smeared some of Frankie's blood on it, then reached down and picked up a hard piece of mud and gravel. She wrapped it all up into a bundle and with all her strength threw the top in the opposite direction. Then she grabbed Frankie's hand, gripping it tightly. That might keep them off our scent for a while. Run! Run for your fucking life! In silence, with only the noise of their heavy panting, they ran and stumbled their way through the darkness. Stopping suddenly, Julie pulled Frankie down onto her knees into the mud. Coughing and spluttering, Frankie gasped for air. "What is it? Is it the dogs?" "Lower your voice, you silly cow." "No, look!" She pointed into the distance and whispered in between breaths. "There is the main road ahead, just like Elliot said. I did wonder if he was so off his face on drugs he'd imagined it. But no, there it is, Frankie. And there is the truck." At last they had a goal. The run had been endless. With all her might, Julie had hoped it was not a wild goose chase. At the end of the field there was an open truck parked on a side road near trees and bushes. Its headlights were on low beam, but in the darkness it lit their way to the main road. Crawling on their stomachs, scratched by the mud which had been hardened by the sun, Julie watched the sight before them with horror. Now they were at the roadside. It was just as Elliot had said. There were dead bodies in a heap on the ground, and Elliot and another man she didn't recognise were being watched over by a guard with a gun while they picked up the bodies and heaved them into the back of the open truck. The smell of the rotting bodies hung in the air and made her want to vomit. She saw Elliot had a cloth tied over his mouth. However, he and the other men had obviously got used to the stench. God knows how long those poor bastards had been dead, and the hot Spanish sun hadn't helped. "What are we going to do now, Julie? That one has a gun. I recognise him from the camp." "I don't know, but we have to get into the back of that truck. I can still hear those bastards in the distance trying to find us. Now they've realised we're free, they won't stop until they do. Our scent is all over that thorny wall and the dogs will have sniffed it out. They might think we're dead already. If not from the bushes, then probably from the fall." "True, but they'll need to make sure. It's their lives or ours when the boss finds out. He'll be so fucking angry if he knows we got away and we could blow the whistle on this farm." Oh well, in for a penny. Mustering what little courage she had left, Julie grabbed Frankie's hand and took a step towards the truck. Frankie hung back. "I haven't gone through all this to be shot. That man will shoot us." "Yes, Frankie. But we're women, and that man still has a prick. I'm wearing a pair of torn shorts and my tits are bare because I threw my vest in that field. I may be scratched to fucking bleeding, but we're still young and in better condition than most of the women back there. He's going to think it's his lucky night. He'll probably want to use us first and then kill us when it's time to leave. Either way, it's all we have." Despondent, Julie held Frankie's hand and walked further into the beam of the truck. Hearing the noises from the bushes, the guard looked up and pointed his gun. "Show yourselves! Who's there?" Pointing his rifle in their direction, he stood and waited. "It's only us. The guard sent us. They thought you might like some company, but they wouldn't give us a lift any further. It's been a long walk." Plastering on her most charming smile despite all the pain she felt, Julie stood in front of him. Still pointing the gun at them, the guard eyed them suspiciously. He looked around and beyond them for anyone else. Striding forward, he grabbed hold of Julie's hair and pushed her down into the headlights of the truck to see her more clearly. Do you know this bitch?" He turned around to a panic-stricken Elliot, who was obviously afraid that Julie would tell the boss that he had left the door open for them. Nodding nervously, he said, "Yeah. She is a new one from the sheds." He pointed at Frankie. "That's her sister." The guard raised his hand and slapped Julie across the face, making her head bang against the truck. "Right, you bitch. You can help these two first, and then we'll have some fun, eh?" His stale breath in her face made her feel sick. His English still had a Spanish accent to it as he barked orders at them. Dazed and reeling from the bang on her head, Julie suddenly felt herself released from the grip of the guard. Opening her eyes properly, she saw that Elliot had hit the guard from behind with a plank of wood, and the man had collapsed to his knees. Clearly, seeing the guard hit Julie had angered Elliot, who was protective of her. Somewhere hidden in the depths he was still a man, and she had become his woman. Rubbing her head, she looked up and saw the other man who'd been throwing bodies into the truck with Elliot take off into the night. "We're getting out of here," she said. "Are you coming with us?" "No. You go." The fight had left him years ago. He was a broken man. The idea of the outside world frightened him more than this after being institutionalized for so long. The guard began to stir and tried to get up. Julie saw that Elliot had picked up the gun and was pointing it at the guard. "Shoot him!" she shouted, but there was no response. Quickly grabbing it from him, Julie held it towards the guard's head. Although her hands were shaking, she fired it and watched him fall to the ground with a bullet hole in his head. Now she knew their time was limited. Their pursuers would have heard the gunshot. "Come with us, Elliot. You'll be okay." She watched as he ignored everything that had gone on and still tried to lift the bodies on his own. He threw one over his shoulder and put it into the truck. "The keys are in the truck. Bye." Elliot was sad to see her leave. She had been the only meaningful human contact he'd had in years. He wanted to help her, even if he couldn't help himself. Rushing forward, she held his face in her hands and kissed him. This time it was for real. She was truly grateful. "Thank you, Elliot, darling. You do realise they'll kill you for this?" When she saw him nod, she knew he welcomed the end. He'd had enough and his body was tired. "Frankie, get in the truck!" "But you can't drive." Frankie was in shock, wide-eyed and staring at her sister. "Well, I'm going to learn bloody fast. How hard can it be?" Seeing lit fire torches looming towards them, she jumped in. The truck stalled and the gears crunched as she tried to change gear, her haste and fear getting the better of her. She tried again and the truck jerked forward. Putting her foot on the accelerator with all her might, she sped off. Through the rear-view mirror, she could see Elliot waving. Tears rolled down her face, not only for Elliot, but because this nightmare was nearly over for them. "Get some sleep. I think I'm getting the hang of it now." Frankie was now crying, half hysterical and shaking. "You killed that man. You could go to prison for murder. What have you done?" "I killed him before he killed us. We've already been in prison, Frankie. Anything else would be a hotel. See if you can grab an old T-shirt for me off one of those bodies in the back, then get some sleep." As Frankie did as she was told, Julie carried on driving, thinking to herself that this was not the first time she had murdered. However, that was another story. Opening the windows and breathing in the fresh air seemed like a luxury. Not knowing where she was driving to was the mystery. Julie had no idea what to do next. She had no money and no passport, and there was no one to contact in England to send them the money they'd need to get back home. All she knew was she had to get as far away from the camp as possible. Turning to check on Frankie in the darkness of the truck, Julie could see she was fast asleep. They were both exhausted, mentally and physically, but the adrenaline and fear drove her on. With each headlight from other cars she saw on the road, she froze, expecting it to be one of her captors. With only the radio on low for company, she could hear the quiet. For once there was no one having bad dreams and shouting out in their sleep, or walking around the hut aimlessly wringing their hands and mumbling to themselves. During the brain-numbing drive, Julie's mind wandered back to how this nightmare had begun. There had been no real time to think about how they'd got into this awful situation. There had only been survival. Each day had been another long, hot day to get through, and all she had concentrated on had been the golden opportunity of escape. She had no idea how or when it would present itself, but when it did, she had grasped it with both hands, not caring about the consequences. She had nothing to lose. Escape and survival, that was the key. Chapter 2. Trafficking. Spain had been a dream come true. It was everything Julie and Frankie had dreamt of. "I'm glad you let me come, although I'm sorry Sheila let you down at the last minute," said Frankie. Julie had lied to Frankie, saying Sheila had let her down because of illness. Poor Sheila had paid for her ticket, and Julie had intended to go with her, and she would be so angry when she found out Julie had gone and robbed her of her money and her long-awaited holiday. But it had been vital that Julie got Frankie away from their home, and there was no turning back now. Julie wondered if she'd been too hasty in taking Frankie, but she'd had no choice. It would only have been a matter of time before that sleazy, drunken bastard stepfather of theirs had helped himself to her innocence. Consoling herself that she'd done the right thing, Julie still felt nervous. Derek had deserved everything he'd got, but in the cold light of day, Julie also felt it might have been easier if she'd just absconded with Frankie. Then there would always be the opportunity of going home. When they landed, the Spanish sun was hot and the beaches were packed with tourists, and to Julie it felt like the best place on earth. No one seemed to care about age or even notice when she took Frankie into one of the nightclubs. They had danced the night away to songs of the 70s without a care in the world. While walking around the town one day, Julie saw a flyer pasted to a lamppost that was offering jobs picking fruit and vegetables. It offered accommodation and good rates of pay. A thought crept into her head. If they had jobs in Spain, then they could stay here. They were already 4 days into their holiday, and she'd nearly spent all her money. Thankfully, some of the men in the clubs had paid for their drinks when chatting them up, but they were running very low on funds, and in a few days they would have to leave their hotel, which Julie dreaded. Oh, the horrible memory of Derek loomed in her mind. They simply couldn't go back to England. Clutching the flyer in her hands, it seemed to be the answer to her prayers. She saw a telephone number at the bottom, and when she dialed, it was answered instantly. Again, she was told of the opportunities and money she could earn. She asked if there were enough vacancies for herself and her sister, and they said they welcomed another pair of hands, stating that the farms where they picked the fruit and vegetables were large and the more the merrier. The woman on the other end of the telephone informed Julie that they had a pick-up point in the centre of town where the coach collected everyone and took them to the farms and accommodation. Thank God, Julie thought, putting her hands together in prayer. Everything was going to work out for the best. "Shouldn't we tell someone where we are?" asked Frankie. "Why?" snapped Julie. "Do you think they've even noticed we're not there? Mum and Derek will probably think we're staying at Gertie's." "No, we have jobs, Frankie, and that means we can stay in Spain. Imagine it, a job where we live in the sun and spend our days off on the beach." "It sounds great. When do we go? I can't wait." Frankie was excited at the prospect of her new home and job. At last, the luck was changing for the better. A few days later, Julie and Frankie made their way to the pick-up point to look for the coach. Once Julie had spotted it, she saw there was quite a queue to get on, and she hoped there would still be enough room for them both. A lot were students and backpackers who just travelled around from one place to another picking up jobs on their way. Quite a few were Spanish, obviously locals who were looking for work. They were all excited as the driver put their cases into the boot of the coach and welcomed them aboard after giving them homemade badges to write their names on and pin to their tops. The long coach drive was tiring, and the further away from the city they got, the more an uneasy feeling came over Julie. She looked around the coach. Everyone was introducing themselves and looking forward to their new jobs, but Julie had a nagging feeling. Maybe Frankie had been right. They were going into the middle of nowhere and no one knew where they were. She felt she'd been too hasty in her decision and should have found out more about it from the receptionist at the hotel. Maybe the locals could have told her more, but there were locals on the coach too. Doubt was creeping in, and call it gut instinct. Suddenly she had the urge to get off. Walking down the aisle of the coach, Julie stood beside the driver. "Will we be going to the accommodation first?" she inquired. She wanted more information. "It's been a long journey and it would be nice to freshen up a little." The coach driver shrugged and made out that he didn't understand her. Pointing his thumb back to the seats, the distasteful look on his face told her he wanted her to go and sit back down. Her anger rising at his snub, Julie turned to everyone else on the coach. Did no one feel the same about this situation, or was she just being paranoid? "Do any of you remember this driver speaking English when we got on the coach?" "Well, I do, but it seems he's been struck dumb now." No one answered her. In fact, they seemed embarrassed that she was making a fuss. Turning to the driver, she shouted at him, "Oi! Stop this coach! I've changed my mind. I want to get off!" Banging on the doors of the coach to make him understand, Julie's face was flushed with anger. What's more, no one else on the coach gave a shit. They were all ignoring her outburst and looking out of the windows. The driver gave her a sideways glance, not wanting to take his eyes off the road. He beckoned her with his finger, and Julie moved closer to him. "Sit down, you mouthy fucking bitch!" Shocked by his manner, her face dropped. Her suspicions were confirmed. Something was definitely wrong. Julie sat down beside Frankie. She wanted to remain calm. Once the coach stopped, she would tell the managers she had changed her mind. They hadn't signed any contracts. "Is everything okay? You seem angry. What did the driver say to you when you shouted at him?" Frankie was used to Julie's outbursts. She had witnessed them all her life. "I'm just bored, and he's an ignorant bastard." Thankfully, half an hour later, the coach stopped, and Julie breathed a sigh of relief. She had mulled over in her head what she would say when they stopped, and now she was going to have her chance. She was definitely going to report that bloody driver. Some of the other passengers had dozed off and were woken by the coach stopping. Julie was itching to get off, but again the feeling of foreboding engulfed her. As she stood up, she looked through the window and could see 3 men. One was in a suit and the other 2 were dressed in trousers and shirts, holding clipboards. The afternoon sun was high and shone brightly. It had been hot and stifling on the bus. Breathing in the fresh air, Julie shielded her eyes from the sun and looked around. For miles and miles, all you could see was farmland. "Stand in line, please," one of the men shouted at them all, gaining their attention and stopping their chatter. Julie stepped forward and looked directly at the man in the suit, determined to get his attention. He was talking in Spanish to the other men with clipboards. She stuck her chin out stubbornly. "We've changed our mind, mister," she said. "Can we jump back on the coach and get a lift back to civilization?" He looked up, angry that she had interrupted his conversation, and calmly walked down the line towards her. The stinging blow across her face made Julie stagger backwards. A young male passenger stepped forward. "Hey, mate, there's no need for violence. Leave her alone or we'll all leave." A loud bang filled the air and he fell to his knees, then flat out on the ground. He was dead. Horrified at what they had just witnessed, everyone looked at each other in stunned disbelief. Before they could say anything, 2 more gunshots were fired into the air by the man in the suit. "Everyone, shut up! You're hurting my ears. Not one word, or you will be next." Shaking and terrified, everyone looked down at the lifeless figure of the young man on the ground and then back up at the man in the suit. No one dared to say a word. The next gunshot could be them. The man in the suit walked arrogantly down the line, inspecting everyone. He looked disgusted. He pointed to one of the men in the line. "This one is too old. Shoot him," he said. Another gunshot was fired, and the man slumped to the ground before he had even had a chance to beg for mercy. Now everyone was terrified and crying hysterically. Some fell to their knees and held their hands together, praying and pleading for their lives. Julie held Frankie's hand tightly and shook her head to stop her from doing the same. She knew begging to this heartless bastard was useless. Julie was shaking inwardly and felt her legs go weak as the man in the suit walked up the line towards her and Frankie. Grabbing Frankie by the jaw, he pulled her forward and inspected her more closely, then nodded to one of the other men who started writing something on his clipboard. "I have another camp for a young girl like you. You're wasted here," he spat out and pushed her back into line beside Julie. There was a cold, evil look in his eyes, and as he looked Julie up and down, she could tell he already disliked her. "You, lady, need to learn some manners and to speak only when spoken to. I have met troublemakers like you before. I have broken their spirits, and I will soon break yours." Biting her tongue and holding back the tears, Julie nodded. This was a time to hold her temper before she joined the 2 men on the ground, leaving Frankie to this merciless bastard. "Can I ask a question, sir?" She lowered her eyes and showed the man the respect he required. He gave a smug, satisfied smile and looked at the other 2 men with him, then turned back to Julie. "That's better. Go on, ask your question." Julie pointed at Frankie. "This is my younger sister. I'd like to stay with her if possible, please. She's a bit slow and will need my help to understand your orders." He looked at Frankie and then back at Julie, then nodded. "Very well, as long as you do as you're told and keep that mouth of yours shut. Any trouble and the deal changes. It is up to you whether you both die or not." His words were cold and heartless. These people meant nothing to him other than slave labour. Although her blood was boiling inside, Julie needed to keep her head for now. Oh, it made her cringe having to be polite to this cold-blooded murderer. "Thank you, sir," she said, then reached out and took Frankie's hand and squeezed it. She knew Frankie wasn't the slow-minded idiot that she had made her out to be, but she also knew Frankie could not cope alone. The only way to keep her safe was to abide by his rules, for the time being at least. "Now, let me show you who rules the roost." "What is your name?" he inquired. "Julie, sir. My name is Julie." She was bargaining for her sister's life and realised subservience was the only way. Ignoring her smile, he said, "Well, Julie. English, eh?" He nodded. "Let me show you who is the boss around here and how fragile your life is. You're nothing to me, so don't even bother trying to charm me. As I have said, you can stay with your sister for the time being to keep her in line. But let me show you how quickly deals can be broken." Pulling Frankie forward, he turned to one of the other men with him. "Rape her," he commanded. "No! Leave her alone!" Julie shouted, much more loudly than she'd intended. Numb and still in shock, Frankie stood wide-eyed with fear. Stepping forward, the man ripped Frankie's blouse, revealing her bare breasts to the people in the line. Frankie screamed and tried to hide herself with her hands, but the man ripped at her blouse again and slapped her, then started undoing the belt on his trousers. "Please, sir," Julie shouted. "We won't give you any trouble. Just leave her alone." Satisfied, the man in the suit held up his hand to stop the assault on Frankie. "Next time, I won't be so generous." Stepping back and ignoring Frankie's cries, he addressed the rest of the line. "Right, listen up. You're all here to work. I want no slacking, or the supervisors will make you speed things up a bit. I want your passports and your wallets. Open your cases. You may take extra clothing, but everything else goes back on the coach." Everyone proceeded to do as they had been told. The line of people was silent as they each handed over their belongings. It was obvious they had all been tricked. This was slave trafficking. Everyone had heard about such things, but this was real. An open-back truck drove up beside them. "Get in!" the man in the suit barked at them all. They were taken to a wasteland with a few large wooden sheds hidden behind an overgrowth of bushes and weeds. Julie felt her heart sink. There were some people milling around. They looked almost like ghosts or zombies. Thin, skeletal, they were wearing dirty, torn shorts and vests. You couldn't tell if they were men or women. Between the huts was a fire with a tripod over it. Hanging from that was a large cooking pot. Julie looked into the pot as they were led past. It held brown, disgusting filth. The man stirring it with a large ladle looked up at her. "You don't get any because you haven't worked yet. If you don't work, you don't eat." Frankie was crying beside her as they walked through the camp. Julie felt helpless. There was nothing she could do. The wooden sheds were empty. They were told to find a spot on the hard stone floor somewhere amongst the dirt and to sit down. Although it was a dark, foul-smelling shithole, Julie and the rest of them were glad to rest their weary legs and get some shade from the sun. They were all in shock after the shootings, but too afraid to show any emotion for fear of repercussions. Guards walked around with rifles. They didn't speak. You were not a person, just someone to be worked to death until the next coachload of fools turned up and then disposed of. Days turned into weeks, and Julie started to lose track of time. The hot sun burnt their skins as they trudged along the fields each day from sun-up to sundown. Picking and digging up potatoes with small trowels was hard work, but if you didn't meet your quota by the end of the day, you were punished. Although it was disgusting, the soup they served filled their stomachs. But Julie quickly realised there was something not quite right about it. The headaches it gave her and the way she passed out after eating it told her that they were drugging it to keep them quiet. Everyone she had seen on the coach that day seemed to have turned into a zombie who just followed orders. That was when she decided not to eat any more of the soup. She needed to keep her wits about her. One day Frankie waltzed into the hut, smiling. "What have you got to smile about?" "Do you remember that man when we first got here? You know, the one in the suit." "Of course I bloody remember him. How do you forget someone who killed 2 innocent people in front of you as a welcoming gift?" snapped Julie, feeling too exhausted to listen to Frankie's ramblings. "I was called to the big caravans where the guards live, and he was there. He was very nice this time. Well, he said he wants me to move to another camp, a better one. He thinks I'm pretty and should be in the movies or a model, something like that," Frankie preened. It was the first time Julie had seen her sister smile in a long time, and her naivety shone through. "What other camp? Where?" Julie felt the panic rising inside her. This was what she had feared. "Did he mention me at all?" "No," Frankie stammered, "but I'm sure he will. I bet he wants to see you next." "Are you fucking stupid? This isn't Hollywood. I have a fair idea about the movies he wants you to star in. It's porn, Frankie love." Julie was afraid if she let them take Frankie now, they would never see each other again. She had to do something, and quick. God knows when that bastard was going to come back for Frankie. The wild, faraway look in Frankie's eyes confirmed Julie's suspicions. "You've been eating that shit again, haven't you?" "I'm hungry, Julie. I can't eat any more tomatoes and raw potatoes. They make me sick. I needed something else, something warm inside me." "I told you, you bloody fool. It's drugged to keep everyone in line. Look around you. They're all fucking dead. We're going to die soon, so we may as well die off our heads. I can't stand it anymore. That person is offering me a ticket out of here and I want to take it. I'm sick of fields, the sun burning me back and the stench in here when everyone has to shit in the same buckets." "Okay, sweetie. I know. I'm hungry too, but we have to be strong. I'll get us out of here, I promise." "You've been saying that every day since we got here. Nothing has changed. We're still here," Frankie shouted at her. Julie felt beaten. There was no clear way out. Her only hope was Elliot, an institutionalised trustee. The time to take their chances and flee this god-awful place was now. What did it matter if they were killed in the process? They were dead anyway. And Elliot had given her an idea. But most of all, he had given her hope. Elliot had been at the camp so long, even he had forgotten who he was. He had no memory of his former life. Now in his 50s, he had become a kind of trustee for their jailers. The bosses knew he was not a threat. His spirit had left him long ago. He had given up on life and accepted his fate. He plodded along, full of emptiness and desperation. Elliot showed all the newcomers where to go and what to do, and did all the fetching and carrying for the bosses. It didn't exclude him from their torment. He still had to work from sun-up to sundown, but he got certain privileges, mainly cigarettes and better food, although it was still laced with drugs to keep him quiet. Everyone was addicted to drugs. No one would ever think of running away because they had become so dependent on their jailers for their fix. However, they were still locked in the sheds at night like caged animals. Elliot helped put the padlocks on the large wooden doors and secured them to keep the workers in, convincing everyone it was for their own protection from the dogs and the night patrollers. It was obvious no one had spoken kindly to Elliot or shown him affection properly in a long time. Julie noticed he had an old cigarette packet, and when the bosses gave him 2 or 3 as payment, he kept topping his packet up. It seemed to be his only possession and his prize one. Each cigarette he had was half smoked, and he kept all the stubs to save the tobacco to make new ones. Julie walked over to him while he sat in his own corner smoking and smiled. "You got a spare one of those?" Grasping the packet close to his chest, he stared at her through glazed eyes. "I'm Julie. I want to be friends. I don't have anything to share with you, though." Elliot eyed Julie suspiciously while she reached out and stroked his crotch. She had watched him and instinctively felt he was her link to freedom. The thin shorts he wore left nothing to the imagination. Maybe she did have something to share after all. Slowly he handed over the cigarette from his own mouth. Elliot never spoke or answered her. He was like a scared rabbit caught in the headlights. First she had to earn his trust. He knew everything about the camp, and even the guards ignored him. After a while he would walk over to her and sit beside her, offering her cigarettes, and Julie would masturbate him. Well, almost, because he couldn't manage a full erection, but he enjoyed the intimacy of it. One day he had given her a piece of chocolate from a bar he had hidden under his makeshift pillow. Puzzled, Juliet looked at it and smiled. How did he have his hands on a bar of chocolate when there was nothing nearby, just rows and rows of fields? It was then Julie realized that Elliot must leave the camp at some time. The very thought of that piece of chocolate gave her hope, and Elliot was the answer. Frankie looked at Julie with disgust. "I don't know how you can sit and talk to him. He's filthy and disgusting. He has no teeth and he stinks." "Haven't you noticed, Frankie? You stink too. We all do." Julie raised her arm and sniffed her armpit. "There's nowhere to wash here." "Elliot's okay. He's a bit weird, but then so are you." As frustrated as Julie was at her younger sister's whining, she loved her. Frankie had always been her little doll. She'd been 4 years old when Frankie was born, and she had fallen in love with her instantly. Julie walked over to Elliot and sat beside him, nudging him playfully with her elbow. "Come on, Elliot, love," she whispered in the darkness. "You can tell me. We're friends. Where did you get the chocolate from?" It was nearly black in the hut now. People around them were snoring. Others had nightmares and cried out. "I get it for helping them with the bodies. I help put them in the truck and bury them. I get extra treats for that." He sounded almost childlike as Julie sat there stunned. "You get rid of bodies? How?" Although she was stunned, she was intrigued. "When they die," he whispered, and reached for her hand and laid it on his crotch. Julie started to stroke him gently while pushing him for more information. She knew she had to treat him with kid gloves and be gentle. Elliot put his finger to his lips. "We can't let anyone find them. We have to get rid of them. Give some to the dogs." Julie's blood ran cold at this revelation. She was glad it was dark, because her smile was forced and weak. "A special truck comes sometimes to take them away. I help them. I get chocolate for it." Elliot seemed very proud of his status as chief gravedigger. So this was how he'd survived all of these years. Julie didn't want to stop pushing for information. She had managed to get Elliot talking, and she didn't want him to clam up. "So, where is this truck? I've never seen one around here." "Go on. You're just kidding me, aren't you?" She laughed playfully and continued stroking him. They were both sitting on the floor in their place. "On the main road, about 10 miles from here, past all those fields." He pointed in mid-air, almost boasting about his secret. "You can't see it because of all the thorn bushes. Very high they are, and painful if they scratch you." Like a young child, he showed Julie some old scratches that had healed on his arms. "Here, let me kiss those for you to make them better." Her voice was warm and soothing as she kissed his arm. "So, when does the truck come?" Holding up his fingers, Elliot indicated 2 days. Julie secretly jumped for joy. She wasn't sure what to do yet, but now was the time to hatch a plan. "You know what, Elliot, darling? And you are my darling. I think you should leave that side padlock undone for when you get back. You'll have worked so hard. Maybe we could sneak out and have a cuddle without all these people watching us." Julie paused, waiting for it to penetrate his brain. When she saw his puzzled frown, she thought she'd gone too far. Maybe he would turn on her and tell the bosses. No, that was a daft idea. She shook her head and smiled reassuringly. "I just thought we could be alone when you get back. But you'll be tired. Anyway, you would have to make sure the padlock wasn't on so I could get out and meet you." She knew she was walking on thin ice, but she could see him thinking it over, and for now, that was enough. Nervous and anxious, Julie lay beside Frankie on the floor and waited until the 2 days were up. She wasn't quite sure what she was going to do, but she was determined to get out of this hellhole. There was no time to lose. Julie kept a close eye on Elliot, not daring to take her eyes off him for 1 minute, and in the early hours of the morning she heard a bang on the shed door. She feigned sleep as Elliot looked around at everyone, then got up and opened the shed door. Not daring to breathe, she realized that she had not heard the usual chilling, depressing noise of the chain being put back through the padlock. She heard it rattle, but nothing else. She waited for what seemed an eternity, not daring to breathe in case the guard came back with Elliot. Eventually she stood up and slowly climbed over the sleeping bodies on the floor in the darkness, then tentatively pushed the door with her finger. Stunned, she realized it wasn't locked. Somewhere in Elliot's foggy brain, the idea of being alone with her had seeped through. Pushing a little further, she saw the thick chain drop to the ground. "Frankie, wake up!" she whispered, trying to shake her sister into consciousness. "We have to go. Quickly now. This is our chance." Bleary-eyed, Frankie yawned and looked up. "What are you talking about?" The glazed look in her eyes confirmed to Julie she had been sneakily eating that bloody soup again. "Be quiet! Get up and follow me!" It was taking time to rouse Frankie into some sort of consciousness. Julie didn't know how much time she had, so gave Frankie a good slap across the face. It seemed to do the trick. After creeping out into the fresh air, Julie was surprised that there was no one around. Holding a finger to her lips, she linked her arm through Frankie's, and slowly they both crept away from the shed. Feeling her way in the dark, Julie tried to fathom out which route to take. She'd looked round over the last couple of days, but all the fields looked the same. When they were safely out of earshot, she pulled on Frankie's arm and they ran towards a maze of bramble bushes. Long thorns stuck out everywhere like barbed wire. It was so overgrown and twice their height. This is what hid them from any authority's suspicion. Frankie's heart sank. "We can't get through there. We'll be torn to shreds. It's impossible." Horror filled them both as they looked at the overgrown wall. "Bollocks! I'd rather die in there than back in that rat hole. We're going to have to climb it. I don't know how thick it is. Pick the lowest bush you can and don't cry out, for God's sake. It's going to be painful, but fuck it. Do you want to go home or not?" The thorns bit at their flesh, which stung as they tried parting the bush with their hands. As they tried to climb over and through, it felt like electric bolts through their bodies. It was agony and they were bleeding. Their hair was tangled up in the bushes and nearly being pulled out by the roots. At last they managed to get through the middle of it. Turning towards Frankie and nodding, Julie hissed, "Jump!" They did, and hit the hard ground on the other side with a thud. Out in the darkness, Julie picked Frankie up off the ground. "We're out now, though God knows where we are. We have to run as far away as possible until we find the road Elliot told me about. Where there are roads, there are cars. Come on, Frankie. I need you to be strong." Now, after putting her plan into place, Elliot had come up trumps for her. Here she was, battered and bleeding, driving through Spain with a truck full of dead bodies in the back. But they were free. Chapter 3. Explosive Territory. "Come on, Ralph, mate, it's quitting time. Bloody hell, do you want to spend all of your days in this quarry? All you think about is dynamite and blowing up stones. Ireland has more to offer than that. It has pretty women, good Guinness and bare-knuckle fighting. Are you ready for tonight?" Tired after a long shift at work, Ralph Goldstein wiped the sweat from his brow. "Yes, I'm okay. And money is money. I want to go home first and see the wife and little Sean." "Why? You know what they look like. I thought we could go for a drink first and rustle up a bit of gambling money." Taking a deep sigh and stepping over the quarry rocks, Ralph straightened his denim dungarees and looked at his best friend Paddy in the eye. "Paddy, mate, I've been out of prison for 6 months. My son was 1 year old when I went inside and now he's 5. I like to see him. Is that okay with you?" Again he wiped the sweat from his face with the back of his hand, then turned his head as the long-awaited whistle blew, informing the workers that the shift was over. "Well, that'll teach you not to drop your pants with a good Catholic girl in Ireland. Best shotgun wedding I've ever been to." Paddy's boyish grin crossed his face and he winked at Ralph. "You should have gone to the synagogue that day and just masturbated like the rest of them. Not exactly a common Irish name, is it? Goldstein." Paddy laughed aloud and kicked some of the stones near him like a football, sending up clouds of dust and nearly blinding himself. "Me father is Jewish and me ma is an Irish Catholic. Now shut it!" Ralph laughed as he saw Paddy wincing and rubbing his leg. "Did that rock hurt your foot?" When he saw him nod, he was satisfied. "Good. Then don't kick them." "Oh, don't get cross, mate. We shared a cell together, eh? That makes us lifelong mates. Drink first, and then you can visit that sprog of yours. No funny business with Irene tonight, though. Not before a fight. It weakens the legs." The coolness of the pub was a welcome respite after a long day. Ralph was hot and sweaty. Songs rang out from the jukebox and the days of war seemed to be behind everyone. This was a new era. "Here you go, Ralph. Nice and cold, just how you like it. Get that Guinness down you, full of iron," the barman joked. Not impressed by the landlord's flippancy, Ralph picked up the pint and took a sip. He knew what the landlord wanted. Ralph had a reputation for bare-knuckle fighting. He had fought most of his life, and especially in prison where it had been dog-eat-dog. He'd kept himself fit, and working in the quarry lifting rocks day in and day out kept his muscles firm and solid. This was bare-knuckle fighting, and tonight there was a match. Although bare-knuckle fighting wasn't illegal, this was a fight with no holes barred, no restrictions apart from weapons. Ralph was a known scrapper and always pulled a crowd. His opponent was the favourite, a man with a hard-earned reputation he was desperate to defend. This pub landlord wanted the fight held in his pub to bring in the customers, but the location was always kept under wraps until the last minute when Paddy spread the word. The Garda, as the Irish police were known, seemed to know all about the illegal gambling and vicious fighting. That was how Ralph had ended up in prison. Grievous bodily harm, they had called it, even though both fighters had agreed to it and accepted any consequences. He hadn't meant to crush the other guy's jaw. It was part of the fight, but he'd been charged when the police had burst into the upstairs room at the pub. It was beginning to be an occupational hazard. However, the last prison sentence had been very productive. He'd shared a cell with a man who had been an explosives expert in the war. He enjoyed telling his wartime stories. Even though it bored a lot of the others, it intrigued Ralph. This man's knowledge was endless. Everyone called him Bandit after the gambling fruit machines with one arm because he had blown one arm off when he had cut the wire on a detonator. But he was good company and Ralph liked him. Once Bandit realised Ralph was interested in his tales of unexploded bombs, he had told him all about explosives. Lying on his top bunk bed, Ralph listened intently, amazed when Bandit told him how to make them. With all that knowledge, it had been easy to get a job when he had gone down to the labour exchange. His prison record went against him, but Ben, the supervisor at the quarry, had given him a chance. Out of bad can sometimes come good. Once Paddy started spreading the word about the fight, people turned up in their droves. Even Ralph had to admit to himself that despite all the secrecy leading up to the event, Paddy wasn't very discreet when it came to announcing where it would be and at what time. In the upstairs room of the pub was a pall of tobacco smoke, making Ralph's eyes sting as he walked in. It was stifling hot, but no windows could be opened because of the shouting and cheering of the men watching the fight. Men sat around on wooden chairs drinking their pints of beer, waiting for the fight to start. But Paddy wouldn't let that happen until he'd taken all the bets. They made a good team, although Ralph didn't trust Paddy an inch. Dropping his braces and taking off his shirt, Ralph stood bare-chested in his trousers and boots. He spied his opponent. He was a big man and carried a lot of weight, but Ralph saw that his belly was soft and most of it was fat. He was losing his edge, past his best, and Ralph fancied his chances of winning. Paddy started the countdown in the middle of the amateur square ring he had roped off, and the fight got underway, much to the pleasure of the onlookers. After 4 long, hard rounds, the other boxer's friends stepped forward and threw the towel in the middle of the ring. Ralph had taken a punch to the eye, and blood streamed down his face, and he realised the other fighter had a razor blade between his knuckles. Much to the annoyance of the baying crowd, the friends of the other boxer shouted, "Enough! Enough! It's over!" Sweat poured from Ralph's body, and he realised his nose was broken again, another occupational hazard. Angry jeers came from the crowd. They wanted more than this. They bayed like a pack of wolves waiting for the kill. "He can't carry on, you bloody idiots!" the opponent's friends shouted at the baying crowd. "His arm is broken!" Lying on the wooden floor, howling in pain, was Ralph's opponent. His face and knuckles were bloody and grazed, and his arm lay awkwardly at his side. Someone threw a pint of beer over him to bring him back to semi-consciousness. "Ralph here is the winner!" Paddy shouted, holding Ralph's arm up in the air. He pulled up a wooden chair and sat Ralph down, then gave him an old bar towel to wipe his face. "Time to collect your winnings, guys, if you were smart enough to put your money on him." He removed the woodbine from his own mouth and gave it to Ralph along with his whiskey. Paddy walked around the room, paying out the winnings from the wad of notes he was holding. It wasn't getting much smaller, which was making his smile wider than usual. The upstart challenger had won this time. Looking over, he gave Ralph a thumbs up. As the crowd started to head back downstairs into the pub, they walked past Ralph's opponent lying on the floor. Showing their disgust, they gave him sly kicks with their boots and called him a loser. Some had spent half their wages on this fight in the hope of winning some back. Now they had to explain to their wives where the rest of the housekeeping money was. Ralph rubbed his aching shoulder. Looking through the sweat and blood running into his eyes, he saw teeth marks clearly imprinted in his shoulder where his opponent had bitten him. Thankfully, Ralph was still wearing his steel toe-cap boots and had raised his leg and kicked the man mercilessly in the balls and yanked at his arm. That was when it had broken. He had heard the snap and then twisted it in return for the razor blade trick. The bastard could have had his eye out. 15 quid, Ralph, mate. Paddy waved the money in the air before Ralph's face. Hand over the rest, you fucking weasel. You took more than that. I might have a swollen eye, but I can still see and count. The smile slowly disappeared from Paddy's face and was immediately replaced by a frown. Did I say 15? Oh no, that is all your cut. Less expenses for the room and good marketing to get the men here. Sulkily, Paddy handed over the money. Ralph knew he hadn't paid anything to use the room at the pub. In fact, he'd probably taken a backhander for filling the pub full of customers. Expenses my arse, he thought. You sort this lot out, Paddy. I'm going home. Ralph picked his shirt up off the beer-drenched floor and then walked downstairs and out of the pub doors into the fresh air. His heart was pounding and he was pleased it had only gone 4 rounds. He was exhausted and hungry. Entering his mother's small 2-bedroomed, barely furnished house with its peeling paint and coal fire, he shouted out for his wife. I'm home, Irene. As he leant over and kissed his mother on the cheek, he secretly handed her £2. I know. It doesn't look good. But I'm okay. Get something nice, Ma. Stroking his battered face gently, his mother smiled. Are you really okay, son? Nodding to reassure her, he sat down. Ralph loved his mother. She'd always stood by him and never judged him. She'd known the hardship of World War II, and for the first few years of Ralph's life, until his father returned from the war, it had only been the 2 of them. Irene came rushing through from the kitchen. Oh, darling, "You're hurt? Have you been fighting again?" Knowing not to ask any more, she disappeared back into the kitchen and returned with a bowl of warm water and disinfectant. "Here, darling, let me clean you up," she said, and began washing away the blood from his hands and face with a flannel. Ralph was too tired to resist, and welcomed the warm water washing away the blood from his cut face, even with the sting of the antiseptic. Ralph reached into his pocket and put £10 on the table before her and watched the smile appear on his wife's face. Ralph liked his wife Irene, but it had never been love. After a couple of dates at the local dance hall, she'd told him she was pregnant. He had no choice but to do the right thing by her. They were both young and stupid at the time, but she was a good woman and she was loyal. Worst of all, he knew she was grateful he'd saved her from shame. She had settled for the hand that fate had dealt her. Irene had caught the bus to Dublin on a regular basis to visit him in prison and had looked after his mother now that his father was dead. There were no other family members to step in. When she, a Catholic, had married his father, a Jew, both sides had walked away. "Do you fancy some good old-fashioned Irish stew to make you feel better?" Irene said. Although Ralph was hungry, he wanted to go to bed. His body ached all over. He walked to the bedroom and almost collapsed on the bed, then looked up at the ceiling in the darkness. There had to be more to life than this. He was a young man with a prison record as long as his arm, and he was living hand to mouth in Ireland with no future. The only certainty was death. No, this was not good enough. He wanted more. There had to be more than this. Chapter 4. Home at last. Julie was exhausted and driving to God knows where when she noticed she was running out of petrol. She knew she had to dump the truck somewhere discreet. After all, it still had half a dozen dead bodies in the back of it. Yawning, she nudged Frankie with her elbow. "Frankie, wake up, love. We have to go." Half asleep and with spit dribbling out of her mouth, Frankie opened her eyes. She was surprised to see that it was early morning and the sun was rising. Rubbing her eyes and sitting up, Frankie looked out of the windows. "Where are we?" She didn't recognise any of the surroundings. "We're near the docks. I don't know exactly. I can't read the signs. We need to dump the truck. We can't be found with those bodies in the back. We're going to have to run for it." Walking along the quayside, Julie knew from the looks on people's faces that they both looked a fright with their scratches and bruises. She felt the heat of the Spanish sun as it warmed her bones. All around her were cargo ships unloading and loading. Men were everywhere and the quayside seemed to be getting busier and busier. Men came pouring out of the dock cafes and pubs as they heard the trawlers and cargo ships blowing their horns as they entered port. Julie and Frankie looked on in awe. Suddenly the dockside had become a hive of activity. People were everywhere, shouting and bumping into them as they pushed past to wave at their old shipmates. As brave as Julie was, she realised she actually felt nervous being surrounded by so many people at once in a confined space. The noise was deafening. Suddenly, Julie began to shake. Whether it was from shock after the previous night or the awful realisation that she had unintentionally become institutionalised, she didn't know. But even after only a couple of months, the outside world seemed loud and daunting. No wonder Elliot felt it was easier to stay put, she thought to herself. She hoped he was okay. Although inside she knew he was probably dead. He would have taken the blame for everything. Pulling herself together and dismissing Elliot from her mind, Julie saw some apples on the ground that must have fallen out of a barrel. She picked them up and handed one to Frankie. Taking a bite to the green.